When natural disasters strike and kill hundreds of innocent people, it tends to make international news. But you'd be surprised how many of these disasters you've never heard of. Such is the case with the Chamoli Disaster. Depending on where you live and how much time you spend reading the news, there is a solid possibility you've never heard of the Chamoli Disaster before. Yet this is a disaster that claimed hundreds of lives, caused major devastation to valuable infrastructure, and happened fairly recently in the year 2021. This is the unbelievable true story of the Chamoli Disaster. February 7th, 2021 started out like any other day for the 500,000 plus residents of the Chamoli district in northern India. The Chamoli district is located in the state of Uttarakhand, a region famous for housing most of India's share of the Himalayas. It is also a very holy place for Hindus. Many of the religion's most valued temples and shrines are located in Uttarakhand, making it a pilgrimage destination for practicing Hindus. Another important thing to know about Uttarakhand is that it is generally quite rural, and the region is not naturally well endowed with land or energy resources. However, thanks to rivers that are mostly fed by snow from the Himalayas, Uttarakhand has been making aggressive moves towards using hydroelectric power in recent decades. This is important because generating hydroelectric power involves building huge dams. In the years leading up to the Chamoli disaster, scientists had been growing increasingly concerned about these dams. Despite their warnings, the Indian government mostly ignored them, which, as we'll soon see, turned out to be a tremendous mistake. Unbeknownst to local residents, trouble first began way up high, atop the colossal mountain in Uttarakhand and one of the tallest mountains in the world. Nanda Devi stands at a colossal 25,600 feet. The mountain is designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and has its own surrounding national park. That day, February 7th, warming temperatures caused an enormous chunk of rock and ice to become dislodged. And when I say enormous, I mean enormous. Later analysis done by satellite would reveal that the chunk was roughly the length of 15 football fields and the width of 5 football fields. You could have built a small civilization on this thing. But of course your small civilization would have been doomed because in a flash this incredible mass of debris all came loose at once. Unless you'd been down in the valley watching with binoculars, you and the rest of Uttarakhand's 11 million residents would have had no idea that anything out of the ordinary was happening. It was just a regular, bright and sunny day. But as luck would have it, the fact that it was bright and sunny turned out to be seriously bad news. As the massive avalanche made its way down the high mountain slopes, it began to melt. This created exactly the kind of nightmare scenarios scientists had been trying to warn Indian officials about. A heavy, rapid onslaught of icy gray water descended upon the villages below, faster than anybody had time to react. It quickly entered the Daliganga River Valley, one of the region's main waterways. Multiple hydroelectric dams were located along this waterway. One of them was the Tapovan Dam, part of the Rishiganga project. This expensive dam and the surrounding project were in danger of suffering serious damage due to all the excess water heading its way. But to say that the melted snow from Nanda Devi merely damaged the Tapovan Dam would be an understatement. Rather than simply stress it or overload it, it erased the Tapovan Dam off the face of the earth entirely. Nearly 40 workers who had been inside a 12 by 15 foot tunnel suddenly found themselves inside the largest, coldest, and least fun water slide any of them had ever ridden. Making things even less fun was the fact that the water was full of debris. The debris included huge chunks of rock, as well as bridges, houses, walls, sheep, goats, and human body parts, all thrashing at increasingly high speed. Several major bridges got swallowed by the flood. These were bridges that local officials had thought were built way higher than the water could ever possibly go. The highest bridge had been built a whopping 40 feet above typical water levels. In total, 5 bridges were destroyed. This rendered no less than 13 local villages inaccessible. This dramatically disrupted local transportation routes at a time when local people would have been very keen to use them. Trapped in their villages, watching in horror as expensive industrial projects got decimated, many of the people of Uttarakhand had no choice but to be swept away. Swept away with them was also the Daliganga Dam, which sat at the confluence of two major rivers in the valley. For workers trying to flee to safety, and local officials trying desperately to figure out how to mitigate the torrential flooding, the disintegration of this second huge dam was not helpful. The water went on to furiously destroy multiple hydroelectric projects entirely. This included a particularly large and expensive project owned by India's National Thermal Power Corporation. More than 170 people were on site working there when the flood struck. Indian authorities were afraid that the water might reach as far as the city of Haridwar, and numerous villages miles away were all mandatorily evacuated. They also made what might seem at first like an insane decision. They decided to deliberately empty other dams that were further downstream. The reason they did this was so that when the flood waters arrived, the dams would meet them with an empty stomach and hopefully have enough room to avoid overflowing. This worked. The destructive flood was eventually halted. But now came the scary part, assessing the damage. The damage caused by this one melted Himalayan glacier was astonishing. More than 200 people were missing, and wherever they'd gone off to, it probably wasn't good. 140 of them were workers from the Tapovan hydropower plant. 30 workers remained trapped inside the water slide from hell, which was now just a tunnel buried under debris. They would remain stuck there for an additional 6 days. A truly massive rescue operation got underway, involving more than 600 rescue workers and volunteers. Sifting through the grisly damage took months. By May of 2021, it was reported that 83 bodies had been found. They also found 36 body parts. Rescuers also weren't just finding human body parts. They also found the remains of sheep and goats, which had presumably belonged to a total of 5 shepherds who were also missing in the flood. It was estimated that a total of 180 farm animals were swept away. Damage caused by the flood continued to haunt local infrastructure in the months following it. In the village of Joshimeth, as recently as January of 2023, locals evacuated hundreds of homes after cracks started appearing in walls. A local temple also collapsed, due in part to damage from extreme weather events such as the Chamoli Disaster. The people of northern India were more than just devastated by this tragedy. They were also really pissed off. Scientists had pleaded with the government not to build dams just like the ones that ended up being destroyed by the flood and making it 10 times worse. Specifically, they had urged for no dams to be built in the periglacial zone, meaning in valleys where the base elevation is more than 7,000 feet above sea level. The government responded to these warnings by building unusually wide and smooth freeways all over the hills of Uttarakhand so even more people could come and apply for hydroelectric jobs. They also built multiple hydroelectric projects in the very same periglacial zones the experts explicitly told them not to. Residents of a small village called Reni, which was brutally damaged by the eventual flooding, had expressed concerns about the dams when they were still under construction. Building them involved major explosive blasting of rocks in the area. This blasting did more than make Reni's residents unable to sleep or hear themselves think. It also caused the village of Reni itself to start moving. According to the headman of the village, during the course of the construction project, a total of about half of the entire village slid precipitously as if it was about to crumble in a deadly landslide. The people of Reni had politely requested to be given permission to relocate. But over the deafening roar of the construction of their expert-not-approved village landslide causing dams, the government apparently did not hear the sound of their request. In the end, the Chamoli disaster was more than just a remarkably destructive tragedy. Like many significant disasters throughout history, it stands as an inflection point in the ongoing tension between industry and the climate change that industry continues to cause. Temperatures have been rising concerningly quickly in the Himalayas for years, and indeed, it was rising temperatures that not only caused the glacier to break off, but then caused it to melt and turn it into an epic flood. Add to that the disregard for expert advice displayed by local officials, and this becomes an almost biblical tale of climate change gone wrong. What's amazing is that while this story certainly got plenty of news coverage, including in Western media outlets such as the New York Times and Scientific American, I'd never heard of it before. It's possible you had, but I'd bet there's a good chance you hadn't either. Hopefully, this video can help to change that, as it seems like a very underrated story in terms of both the tragic loss of life and also how relevant it is in the context of today's global issues. People are often surprised to learn that fishing is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. More surprising still, the same danger also often applies when it comes to fishing for sport. In the United States, fishing accounts for nearly 1/10 of all sports-related injuries around the country. Sport fishing doesn't get any safer across the rest of the world either. In Australia, rock fishing is the #1 most deadly sport, period. And in the eastern state of New South Wales, rock fishers have been risking their lives in one of the most dangerous areas on the planet for rock fishing, Honeycomb Rocks at Port Kembla. For many, the risk is not paying off. In fact, in just the last 2 years, 6 people have been killed in this one location. Yet despite this, and despite some highly conspicuous signs posted by desperate officials, rock fishers continue to visit the area. So, what makes Honeycomb Rock so dangerous? And what makes it such a good rock fishing spot that dozens continue to risk their lives to fish there? Let's dive into the recent history of fatalities here and see if we can find some answers. Port Kembla, the port which houses the fabled Honeycomb Rocks, is the largest motor vehicle importation terminal in New South Wales. They also export lots of grain and play a big role in mining and steel, both of which are big business here. If you hadn't assumed so already, Port Kembla is also a town. It's quite small, only about 5,000 residents as of the 2016 Australian census. However, this tiny locale on the bottom right corner of the land down under gets an outsized amount of attention, thanks to its wider popularity with the fishing community, many of whom travel from far and wide to dip their hooks in the port's waters. According to a Facebook group I found, which has significantly more members than the entire population of Port Kembla, this particular area is a unique waterway where fishing enthusiasts have a chance to catch species of fish they have never caught before and may never catch again. The port is roughly 100 kilometers south of Sydney. Its coastline faces southeast towards the Tasman Sea, known locally as the Ditch, which separates Australia and New Zealand. For most of the world's population, this is an extremely remote far corner of the ocean, and if you love fishing enough, you might find yourself traveling hundreds or even thousands of miles just to see what you can find buried underneath its deep blue surface. Making the area even more appealing are the rock formations that line the coast, making it so you don't need to climb onto any boat or pack any motion sickness pills to cast your line into the water. All you've got to do is walk out toward the edge of the cliff and start fishing. How dangerous could that be? Well, as it turns out, catastrophically. Unlike the local population, the waves at Honeycomb Rocks in Port Kembla are not small. They are, in fact, really, really big, and fairly unpredictable too. Without warning, the hostile ocean will reach up and swat people off the cliffside like flies, swallowing them whole. This has apparently been happening for a long time, but with a name like Honeycomb, the rocks just don't seem dangerous to the people who walk out onto them. Looking at maps and photographs online, the rocks look relatively flat and like they cover a wide area, so no risky climbing and very little apparent risk of falling over any edges, given the generous space. What nobody expects are the waves. With shocking regularity, this backfires. In March 2009, Wan Ook Lee and his son Dennis were fishing at Honeycomb Rocks. Both were from nearby Sydney, and both were experienced rock fishermen. All was going well until, without warning, a giant wave erupted over them, consuming both of them in sea foam. It not only knocked the men off their feet, it pulled them off of the rocks altogether and out into the ocean. Dennis eventually got his bearings and resurfaced. He tread water while looking for any sign of his father, but after 15 minutes, he hadn't seen him. At that point, a rescue helicopter arrived and pulled Dennis to safety. His father, 71-year-old Wan Ook Lee, was never found. This tragic accident rocked the small town of Port Kembla, but it wouldn't take long at all for the story to repeat itself. In July 2009, just a few months after the death of Wan Ook Lee, a 33-year-old man from Marrickville named Min Loy Truong suddenly disappeared after standing out on Honeycomb Rocks. It seems likely he was also rock fishing, but all authorities were ever able to recover from the sea were some of his clothes and his wallet. it was determined that he, too, had been suddenly swept away by a rogue wave. The following year, a man from the New South Wales city of Yagoona was rock fishing at Honeycomb Rocks. His name was Han-Fei Cho, and despite the fact that according to his friends he was not a strong swimmer, the 43-year-old was out on the rocks without a life jacket, a testament to how deceptively safe the area seems to be to most people. You can probably guess what happened next. Just when he least expected it, poor Han-Fei Cho was standing in the shadow of a ferocious wave. The ocean swallowed him, fishing rod and all, ending his life in the blink of an eye. Despite at least 3 major incidents occurring within the last year, it only took 1 month for the waves to claim their next victim. This time, it wasn't at Honeycomb Rocks, but at a blowhole a few miles down the coast with a similar rocky outcrop popular with the fishing community. The same waves roil here as well, and what happened added to the same growing concern about the safety, or lack thereof, involved in rock fishing in the area. A trio of rock fishing friends was suddenly cut down to 2 when a huge wave came and swept 41-year-old Hiki Kim off his feet and into the water. Unlike Han-Fei Cho, Kim was considered to be a strong swimmer, but nevertheless he was gone. This is as good of a time as any to ask the question, why do even strong swimmers still succumb to the waves off the coast of Port Kembla? It's one thing to be swept off your feet and thrown into the water, but it's another thing to then drown in the water afterward. One terrifying reason why this might happen is that it isn't just the waves along the shoreline that can be volatile. The Tasman Sea as a whole is actually one of the roughest bodies of water in the entire world. New Zealand, Australia's neighbor on the other side of the Tasman Sea, boasts some of the tallest waves you'll ever see on this planet. In 2018, a rescue helicopter, which was presumably quite busy that day, spotted a wave in the Tasman Sea that measured a whopping 120 feet high. That's roughly big enough to engulf Brazil's famous Christ the Redeemer statue. The Tasman Sea is violent like this because it sits at the meeting point between the Pacific Ocean and the Southern Sea around Antarctica, 2 massive oceans with very different water temperatures. The result is a whirlwind of activity that makes the ditch one of the most notoriously difficult places to sail. It's also not always a great place to swim, especially if the swim is unplanned. This is what Hiki Kim sadly discovered in May of 2010, like numerous unfortunate rock fishers before him. It was after the death of Hiki Kim that the New South Wales Coroner's Court decided something needed to be done. The Coroner's Court is a government organization put in charge of investigating sudden or unexplained deaths. Honeycomb Rocks in Port Kembla was starting to look like a good place for them to conduct an investigation, so they did. As you might imagine, the investigation revealed that while these deaths were quite sudden, they certainly weren't unexplained. The local government moved to set up angel rings, often referred to in other places as life preservers, around the area. They also produced educational content in various languages about the dangers. The deputy state coroner at the time also recommended that it be mandatory for rock fishers to wear life jackets. At the time this video was produced, rock fishers are still not legally required to wear life jackets or other important safety equipment, such as specially designed rock fishing boots, when fishing in Port Kembla. Calls have grown louder in the last couple of years after 7 new people have been killed at this one location. The date was January 22, 2021, a Friday. For Australians, this is the middle of the summer, and in Port Kembla, the average day in January is a California-like 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Sure, it's a lot more humid and tends to rain more often, but that Friday there was no rain, and people were out and about. A group of 3, one 69-year-old man from Campsie and 2 men in their mid and late 40s from Green Valley, were all swept off of Honeycomb Rocks with their fishing rods in hand. The older man was wearing a life jacket, but the life jacket was black, making it hard for rescue workers to see. All 3 men drowned. Along with them, 2 other rock fishers were swept away by the same wave but survived, re-emerging from the waves with only minor injuries. The event was so sudden and so dramatic that nobody at the scene was sure how many people had been swept away. It was only after days had passed with no reports of any additional missing people that the authorities concluded it had been no more than those 5. There had been about a dozen people fishing on the rocks in total when the wave hit. This all happened only 24 hours after another fisherman, who had been fishing at Coffe's Harbor on the north coast of New South Wales, had also been swept away by the sea and drowned. This made for no doubt one of the bloodiest weeks in Australian fishing history. Less than a month later, the death count would shoot upward once again. 3 men fishing at Honeycomb Rocks on Friday, February 12th, were all suddenly assaulted by a deadly wave. All 3 vanished into the water below, right around 7 p.m., Determined to prevent yet another tragedy at this same location, New South Wales quickly sent out an ambulance crew, an inflatable rescue boat, a rescue helicopter, and the police all to the scene in Port Kembla. One highway patrol officer named Nick Park leapt into the water and proceeded to swim a distance of more than 300 feet through roiling waves until he reached where two of the men were. All three, the officer and the two men he had located, were picked up by the rescue boat. Meanwhile, the third fisherman was winched out of the water by the rescue helicopter and sent straight away to the hospital, where, unfortunately, doctors were unable to save him from his injuries and he eventually died. The rescue boat landed at Port Kembla Beach, and ambulance workers began attempting to perform CPR on one of the rescued fishermen. Sadly, this was to no avail, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. However, thanks to the heroic efforts of Aquaman, the Australian Highway Patrol officer, and the rest of the rescue team, the other fishermen in the rescue boat did actually survive. The waves were so deadly that day that two other police officers who were merely out spotting for the rescue helicopter were also hit by a powerful wave, and both sustained minor injuries. After all the chaos had finally simmered down, local authorities somberly added 2 more to the 2021 death count at Honeycomb Rocks, for a total of 5 so far that year, and it was only February. Possibly due to word of the tragic mayhem spreading around the fishing community, the deaths stopped for the remainder of 2021. But in 2022, just a few months into the year, Honeycomb Rocks would claim its next, and to date most recent, casualty. Brendan Hurd was from a suburb in New South Wales called Berkeley. Hurd was just 19 years old, and he was out fishing at Honeycomb Rocks with 2 friends on the afternoon of Monday, April 25th, 2022. As it had already happened so many times before, the young Hurd and his 2 fishing buddies were all abruptly and unexpectedly swallowed by a surging wave. Hurd's 2 friends, one of whom was 17 and the other of whom was 50, both managed to swim their way out of the writhing, angry waters. They were eventually pulled to shore with minor injuries by other people who had seen the drama unfold, but Brendan Hurd was nowhere to be seen. It would take another 2 days before rescue crews would finally recover his body, confirming the young man had heartbreakingly become the 6th person since 2021 to die at Honeycomb Falls. Australian MP Paul Scully posted on Facebook after Hurd's death that enough is enough. He called for making life jackets mandatory at the location and for greater effort to be put into a public awareness campaign. The post included a photo of a warning sign posted at Honeycomb Rocks with the death toll since 2021 ticked at 5. Of course, shortly after the post was made, the sign would be updated to 6. Looking across just the last decade or so, when the public has first started to become more broadly aware of what's going on, the sheer lethality of this place is astonishing. Not only does it kill at a high rate, but it often seems to take lives in batches, sweeping whole handfuls of unsuspecting fishermen into the abyss. Something this powerful and this terrifying you'd think would get more recognition among the community, but it appears to be an ongoing dilemma for local officials to compel better safety practices. Nick Reinberger of ABC News traveled to Honeycomb Rocks in June of 2022 and interviewed some of the people who were fishing there at the time. He found that, even still, many were unaware that the Weather Service had issued a dangerous surf report for the area. He also noticed that, among a group of 6, they only had 1 life jacket. Nobody was wearing rock fishing boots either. A volunteer at the nearby marine rescue station he spoke to also pointed out that everyone was wearing black, which would make them harder to find in the event of a rescue. We can only hope that this video can help spread awareness about the dangers of fishing at Honeycomb Rocks. In an ideal world, fishing enthusiasts would still be able to reap the benefits of this beautiful location, offering loads of unique catches, while coming fully prepared with the proper equipment and paying careful attention to the weather reports ahead of time. Maybe then, over time, Honeycomb Rocks could eventually become as harmless as its name suggests. We hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Would you ever consider fishing at Honeycomb Rocks in Australia? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and please be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this in the near future. That's all for now. See you next time.